Well, this is my favorite time of year. The harvest is in, and it's time to celebrate with family and with friends. And if we find some good food along the way, that's something good to celebrate as well. For me, in this time of year, so many great memories come to my recollection. And actually, you know what? Thinking about forgetting, it probably is a good thing for me before I get talking to introduce myself. My name is Boaz, and if my name sounds a little bit foreign to you, maybe I can help you remember that it means strength. Now, I always chuckle a little bit when I think about what my name means because I don't feel so strong. Maybe some of you feel like me, normal. Most of my life is surrounded by the mundane. So when people say, Boaz, strength, I certainly don't feel like that's me. At the same time, I like my name because it reminds me of who I want to be. I want to be strong for my wife and my children. I want to be strong for people that I know that look to me for protection and care. I'm actually a farmer, and I run my own business, and I have people that work on the land, and so there's a lot of people that are looking to me for care and for provision. In fact, in my country, in Israel at this time, things are unsettled. We don't have a king, and it seems like many people just want to do what's right in their own eyes, and so that makes people unsettled. So a lot of people are looking for a safe place, a place to find shelter. And so I always do hope that I can provide some wings, some measure of strength, that they can find peace. But you know what? There's actually another reason, biggest reason, why I like my name. And it's because it reminds me of where real strength can be found. I'm not strong, but I do know who is. The Jehovah God of Israel. He's strong. And he's the one in whom we find all the protection, all the care, all the provision under his wings. And so my name reminds me to look to him and to him alone, which is part of why I just love this time right after the harvest, because we're celebrating his goodness and we're celebrating his provision, and in so many ways we're celebrating his strength. And so I find this to be an amazing and a festive time. I wonder, do you have those times in your culture, these times where you gather and come together and just remember who God is? I find that these are times that are good for telling stories. And I was wondering this morning, if you had just a little bit of time, if I could share with you a story from one of my favorite harvest celebrations. It's one that I'll never, ever forget. It actually happened, upwards to now 10 years ago or so. And I'll remember how everything started. You see, I was coming back from Bethlehem, my hometown, conducting some business there, and was on the way back to my farm, my fields in the countryside. And as I was coming down the road, I happened to see my workers, and they were busy in the fields. And then behind them were a number of people who were gleaning and picking up the stalks that they had left behind. Now, I got to explain to you that that's not anything that was peculiar at all. You see, God in the Torah had given a very special commission to landowners like me, and he had directed us not to glean our fields in a greedy way, but that as our workers went through, they were to leave some extras so that the poor and people who were in need could come behind us and could gather up and find their provisions. And so that was something that I cherished. I always wanted to care for those who were poor and in need and to reflect the generous heart of God. So we talked about this on my farm. I trained our workers to do so. So the fact that there was leftovers and there were people that were coming behind them, that wasn't anything that was unique. What comes to my memory was that there was one particular individual who was gleaning behind our workers. And it was a young woman. And she was hot. What I mean is she was working, and the sun was coming down, and she was working up a sweat, and she was really committed to the task. And right from the start, I could see, even by the way that she worked, that she was someone who was committed, a faithful person. I was intrigued. I wondered, who was this? So I called one of my overseers to me, and I said, hey, you guys are doing great work today. Can you tell me any story on who this young woman is here? unique, particularly because she seems to be out here all by herself. And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. This is the young Moabite who has returned with Naomi, who is now living in Bethlehem. Okay, all of a sudden, some lights started going off and puzzle pieces were being put back together. Yes, Naomi. Naomi was the wife of my cousin Elimelech. We grew up in town together, and actually during a time of famine some years back, they'd left to go find greener pastures in the country of Moab, and then hadn't heard from them for many years. Well, all of a sudden, the town was abuzz just a little while ago, the fact that Naomi had come back. I have to tell you, I was always saddened that Elimelech and his family had left. But I was doubly sad to hear the story of Naomi when she returned. Things just hadn't gone well for them at all in Moab. And in fact, Elimelech had passed away. Their two sons, who I had met as little ones, also had passed away. And here Naomi was returning not in any sense of joy or victory, but in a great sense of heartache and tragedy, alone, except for this one young woman who had come with her. This woman whose story was becoming more and more intriguing to me by the moment. Now, I had meant to check in on Naomi. It was something that was very much present on my heart. I wanted to check in with her and make sure that she had food and make sure that they had provisions and housing. But sure enough, God was now beating me to it, because here in my own field, and certainly not by any accident whatsoever, was this very woman who had come back with Naomi. You know, as I thought about this young Moabite woman, I couldn't help but think more of her story and start to wonder, goodness, what an amazing person. What an act of sacrifice that she was enacting on behalf of my cousin's widow. Here she was coming back to Israel, to this completely foreign place, and certainly there was no benefit to her. It didn't seem like there were a lot of prospects for her. She was leaving behind everything, her family and her culture, and yet here she was. Again, the more that I thought about her story, the more I realized I just needed to talk with her and to hear more. So I determined at the very next break in the work, I would indeed go and introduce myself to her. I was blessed to have a talk with this young woman. First off, I learned her name. It was Ruth. Up until that point, everybody just continued to refer to her as the Moabite woman who returned with Naomi. That's not much by way of identity. There was so much more to her. This commitment, this faithfulness, and this testimony that she was willing to leave everything behind to care for my cousin Naomi. It's really incredible. In the course of our conversation, I really felt my heart warm to her and, of course, to Naomi and her plight. And so I found myself blessing her and assuring her that as long as she was within my presence in our land, she could count on protection and she could count on provision. She need not worry. And at the same time, I found myself directing her, again, not to my strength, but to the strength of Jehovah God, under whose wings she could find a refuge that she was looking for. You know, a couple things struck me in our initial conversation. One, and maybe I blushed just a little bit, I did find myself attracted to this young woman. Beautiful character, and she's pretty too. The other thing that sticks with me is that I felt that as I spoke of the Jehovah's wings to her, that there was some predictive force behind my words. That indeed a story was being written, something was going on that was even greater than I could imagine at present. Well, if you like the story to this point, it's just getting going, and the best parts are yet to come. Just a little while later, a few weeks, it was actually time to wrap up the harvest. Everything is gleaned. It was time to store. It was time to sell the harvest. And that is a time of a lot of work. The winnowing process is not for the faint of heart. In fact, the men, as we do this work, we don't even go home at the end of the day. It just takes so much out of us. We just stay right on the winnowing floor. At the end of the day, we pull our cloak over us after eating a little bit, and we just zonk out to wake up the next morning early and keep on going. It was one of these nights, in fact, the middle of the night, where I woke up, startled by something jostling at my feet. My first thought was bandits were under attack, thieves. As I mentioned, these are unsettled days in Israel, certainly not safe. You had to have your wits about you. Well, it wasn't bandits, but I'll tell you, I couldn't have been prepared for who it was. It was Ruth. Ruth was there in the middle of the night at my feet. Ruth, what was she doing here? Well, questions were answered very quickly. Ruth had come, and she had very specifically laid herself at my feet, a place of humility, a place of submission in our particular culture. And she had come with the greatest of requests. Ruth was coming and asking if I would be willing to symbolically spread my cloak, spread my wings over her and over Naomi, and become to them and Elimelech's inheritance what we know of as a family redeemer. Now, maybe to you that concept is something that's completely new, so I'll just explain it to you just a little bit. But in our culture, if a man like my cousin Elimelech passes away and he doesn't have any children or heirs to pass along his inheritance of land and household to, it's the duty, it's the honor of the nearest male relative to stand in, to redeem his inheritance, to care for his widow. And if the Lord would supply, allow them to raise up a family and descendants for the inheritance, the lineage of the man who had passed away. This is what Ruth had come to ask of me. And it was indeed the grandest of request. It was a big request, a big thing for Ruth to come and ask. First of all, she came in the middle of the night, all by herself, across dark fields without protection, as a woman alone, literally, I think, putting her life on the line, also putting her own honor on the line. What if I was to have said no? What if I was to have said, what are you doing here? Please leave. Don't ever come near my property again. She was placing everything on the line. But it was a big request also from me to take on the responsibilities of a new family, of more property, to seek to raise up a lineage for another household, and to do this not so that I'd be blessed personally, but so that the descendants of my cousin would be blessed. This was big. Certainly not something to be going into without giving it considerable thought. And yet, right from the start, I was inclined to desire and to say yes to this request from Ruth. First off, this had been the desire of my heart already. I had seen Naomi and Ruth's plight. I could see the need for a family redeemer to step in, and I believe I started to sense the Lord laying this on my heart, that this role would indeed be fulfilled by me. So my heart was already inclined in this direction, should the Lord guide. But I was also inclined to say yes because of who was asking. This was Ruth. Now, I've laid some of my cards on the table, so I'll continue. So I could continue to get to know Ruth and her heart. My soul was drawn to her. Her request was not wholly unpleasant to me. I want to be honest and clear in stating that to you. But I have to tell you also, Ruth, and the fact that she was opening her heart to me moved me very deeply. As I mentioned, I had started to think, would this perhaps be where God was leading? And yet I held back. I was holding back, partly in fact that here I was past my prime. Here is Ruth, this young woman. Surely she could have her pick of all kinds of young suitors. I didn't want to saddle her with this older, unattractive redeemer. And yet here she was, once again showing her self-sacrifice, opening her heart to me, this most unattractive, maybe most unlikely of redeemers, all because she loved Naomi, all because of her honor and her care. Once again, my heart was grown to her all the more. You know, I know some people would say, well, Boaz, I hear your heart, and you've always had a heart to care for people, but go slow. Remember, Ruth is a Moabite. She's got a lot of virtue. We don't doubt that. But remember, she's not one of our people. She's a Gentile. She's a foreigner. And true enough, there would be individuals who would never be able to see past that. But I couldn't help but continue to see in her faithfulness and dedication and love and loyalty and character, the likes that our God longed to see naturally within the heart of his own people, Israel, here displayed right in the heart of this Moabite woman. And then I have to tell you this. I couldn't help but think how much Ruth reminded me of my grandmother, Rahab. Rahab, someone who was well known in Israel. Now, I have to admit, my own grandmother had a bit of her own backstory. I won't get too much into all the details of that, only to say that she was a woman who was so much more than her past. As Joshua had come into the land, as God's promises were enacted, Rahab was someone who could see ahead. And she was someone who was faithful, who was filled with faith. And through her, God did a remarkable, amazing work. And once again, I see in Ruth some of the very things that I saw in my grandmother Rahab. And truly, women like this are worth more than rubies. As I considered Ruth and her request, again, I decided that I would not be afraid to take this woman home to be my wife. The answer to Ruth's question right then and there was a resounding yes and absolutely. And as the morning dawned, I sent her away to await further instructions. But as she went, I packed up a cloak full of as much grain as I possibly could. And this was a gift to her, and this was a seal that her hope had already begun to dawn. Her redemption was coming, and she would never need to fear being hungry again. As Ruth departed, a face suddenly came to my memory. It was the face of my mother, my mamishi. God rest her soul. And as her face came to mind, words that she shared with me more often than I'll admit that I wanted to hear also came to me. Boaz, I love you, my little boy, but the good ones keep getting away because you're a slow mover. Mamishi, not this time. Not this time. I made it up in my mind that we would settle this matter today, this very, very day. Now, you might wonder, what was there to settle? I mean, they needed a redeemer. You like Ruth. Ruth likes you. Done, right? Well, no, there was actually one big piece of all of this that needed to be settled. In fact, there was another relative who was closer to my cousin Elimelech than I was. You see, once again, as it comes down to the traditions and the legalities of the family redeemer, it was the right of the closest relative to step in and to claim that inheritance and to raise up a lineage for the family member. And so I knew as a man of honor, I couldn't simply just pass over him without making sure that he knew about what was going on in the land and Naomi and Ruth. So as quickly as I could, I headed to town and I arranged a meeting with the leaders of our town, the elders that we call them, and also with this other relative. And in the midst of this meeting, I just simply laid everything on the table. I explained again the plight of Ruth and Naomi. I also presented the fact that there was this land that was needing to be redeemed and that this man had the opportunity to step into this honorable role of the family redeemer. Well, at first he was incredibly interested. He wanted to know particularly about the land and the assets and its fruitfulness. I could see that was what drew his attention more than anything else. Certainly in this time in Israel, land was hard to come by. So for him to gain this land was certainly going to increase his standing in our community and his overall assets. So he was particularly interested. And then I played my ace card. I reminded him that while that was indeed a blessing, that with this came so much more. This was not just about the benefits to the family redeemer. This was to bless those who needed to be redeemed. There was Naomi to care for. And indeed, Ruth, who would be married to the family redeemer with the hopes that God would provide a child and redemption for this family line. Once all those things were laid out, this man hit the brakes in many ways. Then all of a sudden, he wasn't as interested anymore. At this point in time, he realized, you know what? That's a lot more than I had bargained for. And indeed, to step into those responsibilities, we're going to put my current assets at risk. This man declined. No, he would not stand as a family redeemer. I had a swelling of very mixed emotions at that point in time. Anger and relief. On the one hand, I was angered. How could this man do this? How could this man see the need of Naomi? How could he see Ruth? How could he see the family and the need for redemption? How could he shirk his duty? This was not like Jehovah God and the love that he displays to his people. This is not the picture of his strong and protective wings that he longs to gather as many people under. This man was missing the duty, the responsibility that was his to show the whole world what that was. And yet at the same time, relief. Relief because the desires of my heart now could be fulfilled. All obstacles were removed. I now would have the blessing and the honor of becoming family redeemer to Naomi, and indeed to marry Ruth, and to pray that God would bless us that we might raise up an inheritance, a lineage, and descendants for Elimelech's honor. The leaders of Bethlehem were really excited in the midst of these things. They could see that God was doing something special. And so they offered to me and to Ruth a blessing. Even specifically to me, they said, Boaz, we pray that God will make you famous in Bethlehem. Me? Famous? Again, I was chuckling at that. I am just an ordinary guy. Again, my life is full of mostly the mundane. And yet, as I heard their blessing, and if people do remember their story, I hope that they remember not my strength, but the strength of Jehovah God. That they'll remember it was not my protective wings, but rather it was God's wings, ultimately, whose refuge Naomi and Ruth were finding their shadow under. God, Jehovah God. My strength is small compared to the Lord, gracious, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. As I mentioned, this story is one that just always captures my attention every time I come to it. Brings so much joy in my heart. You can see why it's one of my favorite stories to get to share in these festival times. You know, as I mentioned, this is some years back now. God's been so good to me and to Ruth. We were married. God blessed us with a son. We called his name Obed, which means servant of the Lord. Servant of the Lord. You know, if the elders and the leaders of our town had been excited and had offered me a blessing, I mean, you should have seen the women and how excited they were when this little baby came along. They had a double blessing for him and said, we hope that this baby is famous in Israel. Think of that. Famous in all of Israel. You ever have those moments where you're watching your child play? Or maybe you scoop up this little one in your arms and you wonder, who will this person be? Maybe you look even forward and say, who will this child's grandchildren be? Or even way out, who will their grandchildren be? Sometimes I think that as I watch Obed play out in the fields. I don't know. I wonder, maybe some will be kings. Maybe some will be prophets. Maybe some will be ordinary working men like me. Whoever they are. I pray that they will find refuge under Jehovah's wings, and that also through them, many, many will find redemption in the strength of Jehovah God. And that's what I hope for each of you, friends. Boy, I sure hope that you've been encouraged by my story today. And thank you so much for letting me share it with you. And I wonder if in a time of festival, you might have the opportunity to pass that story along to some other people to remember what God has done. In particular, I hope for you that maybe there's ever moments where you feel like really ordinary. Maybe you feel like your life is full of the mundane. Or maybe you feel like you are just not as strong as you wish that you were, that you'll remember Boaz. And then it means strength. But not the strength of humans. The strength of Jehovah God. And that, again, if you're feeling like me, that you are the exact perfect candidate to experience in your own life and then other people through you hope. The hope of the strong and the protective wings of Jehovah spread over you and over them. Well, I'm realizing, friends, that I need to fly. So much winnowing to do and so little time. And so again, I thank you so much for letting me share this with you. And I really do hope that our paths will cross again, that we'll meet again. And that as we do, that we will meet in that one place where God's people, whenever and wherever they live, find their hope born under His wings.